morning. Today we're going to have our Period 8 review for our test tomorrow. Period 8 covers the years 1945 to 1980, and so it begins with the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union and ends with the election of Ronald Reagan defeating Jimmy Carter. There is a lot of information in this time period, but I think a lot of this information is much easier to maybe put together, understand in comparison to previous units. It's information that you're more familiar with in general. We have to look at how America changed between 1945 and 1980. Think about it. When we came out of World War II, we just fought the Japanese, we just fought the Germans, we just ended a war with an atomic bomb. The war itself killed upwards of 70 million people worldwide. You had an ally in the Soviet Union that is now an enemy because we have two fundamentally different visions of what the world is supposed to be. So the Cold War is the backdrop for everything foreign policy and even into some domestic policy here throughout this time period. There is, especially in the 1950s, a great feeling of paranoia, anxiety about what feels like an imminent attack from the Soviet Union coming. But to start things off, Harry Truman is the President of the United States as of April 1945, after Franklin Roosevelt died just before World War II ended. When the war is over, Truman faces a tremendous amount of problems, and it's hard to follow a guy like Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a legend in his own time, and Truman is going to face an abundance of obstacles early on. Just to kind of make a very long story short, at home, there's inflation, there's job shortages, there's housing shortages. If you remember from all the returning GIs, so the GI Bill gets passed to try to alleviate a lot of the problems of the returning soldiers. But in the meantime, Harry Truman's losing a lot of domestic support. So he actually turns against labor unions early on, vetoing the Taft-Hartley bill, which is actually going to cost him some support within the party itself. But when we think of Harry Truman, we don't always think about domestic politics. We tend to think about international politics. In 1946, there was a telegram called the Long Telegram that was delivered by George Kennan from Moscow. And George Kennan outlined a lot of what the Soviets were up to, and it really opened Truman's eyes even more so, because he was always skeptical of the Soviet Union, as to what he needed to do differently in order to combat Soviet expansion. So we adopted a policy of containment. So the Truman Doctrine, policy of containment, we're going to do things to combat the spread of communism, keep communism contained to its current borders. He gave money and supplies and support to Turkey, to Greece, and then obviously the first hot war of the Cold War, the Korean War. We're fighting proxy wars, or the Soviets are fighting proxy wars around the world at this time, meaning the Soviets and the Americans during the Cold War are never directly going to engage each other in war. That would be World War III. As of 1949, both America and the Soviet Union have atomic weapons. So we're going to be doing things like fighting Korea. The Soviets support North Korea. Then eventually, obviously, the Chinese are going to fight the Americans in the Korean War as well. Vietnam would be another example of proxy war. And then later on in the Cold War, we'll be learning about Afghanistan on the Soviets' end of things, and how America help the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, but that's not until period 9. So at this time, there is a growing federal government power. During the 1950s, over half of our budget in some years was going to defense spending. The American public was facing those feelings of fear and anxiety, like I mentioned earlier, that were exhibited in the rise of Joseph McCarthy. So Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, many would consider a demagogue, claimed to have intimate knowledge of communists working in the State Department, and for 3 or 4 year period, basically frightened the American public into accepting the idea that we need to really buckle down as a country, but potentially forfeit some rights and privileges in order to make sure that we are safe. McCarthy was eventually censured by the Senate after he went on the TV and accused many high-ranking generals in the Army of being communist. He lost a lot of influence, and by 1957, he was actually dead. But during the 1950s, just to focus on the Cold War aspect before we get to the economy, you had the atomic bomb the Soviets developed in 1949. You've got Sputnik, which comes out in 1957. 1961, you have the Berlin Wall that goes up, that the Soviets erect. 1962, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest that the world has ever come to nuclear war. There is a lot of turmoil, a lot of tension. The Cold War itself is an arms race, there's a space race. There's this feeling of it's not a matter of if we are going to fight the Soviets, it's a matter of when we're going to fight them. And now that we have atomic bombs, that prospect of fighting is obviously ever more deadly. In 1972, Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev signed SALT, which limits certain types of weapons, opens up trade, normalizes relations for a time. But then in 1979, SALT II was passed, but then not actually put into practice. The feeling of détente was over because the Soviets invaded Afghanistan on Christmas Day, 1979. But going back to the 1950s, let's talk about domestic politics now. The baby boom began in 1946. From 1946 to 1964, there was one baby born approximately every 7 seconds. Suburbs are growing across the country. People are going, to college more. People are, spending a tremendous amount of money. They're buying cars. They're buying televisions. They're living that American dream. Because remember, the parents in the 1950s had to sacrifice so much. They grew up during the Great Depression, during World War II. Their children are going to be the beneficiaries of, basically the parents are, I don't want to say living vicariously, but they're giving their children things that they could not afford. So the American economy in the 50s is booming. Half of the the wealth in the world is in America, half of the manufacturing. But there are cultural shifts that are beginning to develop here. We watched the Elvis and the Ed Sullivan documentary. Elvis is an example of a rock and roll performer who plays, with traditionally black music to a mass audience. And so if you're a parent of the 50s and you watch Elvis dance and sing, there's this feeling of change that might be a bit much for you. So a lot of parents wouldn't let their kids listen to Elvis. In the South, there's already this growing civil rights movement, and the music of people like Elvis is something that people are afraid of because not only because of the rhythms and the dancing, but also because of what it does for race relations. The 50s, there's a time of the fear for parents is juvenile delinquency. A lot of the heroes in movies this time are kind of the bad boys. You got James Dean, Marlon Brando, kind of the darker side of life. I mean, somewhat tamed by modern standards, but still there's this sense that things are changing fairly rapidly. So going to the civil rights movement, in the 1947, you have Jackie Robinson, who breaks the color barrier in baseball. Again, that's not necessarily the movement itself, but it's symbolic of change that is happening. 1955, you have Emmett Till, who's murdered, the 14-year-old African-American who was killed in Mississippi and brutally killed. 1955-56, you have the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks refused to stand up. Martin Luther King took her case and led the boycott in Montgomery. There is great change happening. There's de jure segregation in the South, which is segregation by law. So African Americans in the South are challenging existing Jim Crow laws. They're challenging voting restrictions. They're challenging, lunch counters. With SNCC with their sit-ins. They're challenging the status quo. Southerners respond with things like the White Citizens Councils, which use economics to try to keep civil rights changes from happening. On the extreme example, you have the KKK using violence, intimidation, terror, murder in order to keep the status quo, keep things the way that they are. Obviously, you have more than one civil rights group. You have the NAACP, you have SCLC, you have SNCC, you have CORE, and they might have different tactics, but the whole point is that they're trying to achieve great social change. You have people like Malcolm X who speak for the Nation of Islam. He's murdered in 1965, but his legacy is that there's more of a militant side of the civil rights movement, whereas Martin Luther King practiced nonviolent resistance. Malcolm X was not himself violent per se, but the idea of fighting violence with violence was something that he would have entertained a bit more, which is exhibited by 1965, 66. You start to see a division in the civil rights movement. In 1964, you get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that's passed, which eliminates segregation in all public places. 1965, you have the Voting Rights Act passed, which eliminates literacy tests, and the federal government's now going to enlist Southern blacks to vote. But there is a shift. You have Stokely Carmichael, making SNCC all black. You have the Black Panther Party, which would have, exhibited more of the civil rights aspects of what Malcolm X was getting across. There is a division. During the 60s, there's a lot of turbulence. When JFK is assassinated, for some people, that's the moment where the 60s began as far as the idea, the cultural change, the questioning of authority, the questioning of the way that things have always been. So it's a civil rights movement, yes, but it's more than that as far as society itself is shifting. We're becoming more liberal as a culture. This is evidenced by the Great Society. The Great Society of Lyndon Johnson sought to eliminate poverty in this country by using the federal government to create great change. Creation of Medicare, Medicaid, National Public Broadcasting, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. There's all kinds of money being spent on change in this country economically, socially. And in the 1960s, you see in the civil rights movement, there's change happening, but then there's also violence. There's the urban rioting, there's the different aspects of the civil rights movements that are developing. So Johnson himself calls the commission, the Kerner Commission, and they come out with, there are two Americas. There's, we're moving in two directions. So the last of the civil rights acts of the 60s was the ending redlining and preferential housing. So basically, it gives African Americans an opportunity to move into white neighborhoods, because that would be an example of de facto segregation. The North was not a non-racist place. It wasn't as open as in the South, but there were things like redlining, which would keep African Americans from moving to certain parts of town. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society did make great strides towards reducing poverty, but what killed the Great Society was the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War really breaks open this generation gap that had been developing. And there's always been a generation gap between parents and kids. In the 50s, it's starting to widen a bit, and in the 60s, it's blown wide open. The Vietnam War is the centerpiece of this great social change that's happening. There are protests that erupt all over the country, in cities, on college campuses, and younger people are not seeing the world the same way that their parents were. Parents see this as this generation's cause, their World War II, whereas the kids are seeing this as the federal government expanding power and using fear of communism to justify an international war. So Lyndon Johnson gets the Tonkin Gulf Resolution passed in 1964. 1965, commits ground troops to Vietnam, starts Operation Rolling Thunder. So we are in Vietnam from 1965 to 1975. Obviously, we had been there as far as advisors go, and before this, we'd taken over for the French in 1954. But the war itself, by 1969, we're going to have over 500,000 troops. If you remember correctly, the turning point of the war is considered to be the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive is something that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong actually lose, but the public opinion in the United States completely shifts away from the war. More Americans become doves than hawks, and this is a moment of no return. America is starting to slowly shift conservatively. Late 1960s, there's a backlash. Again, there's ebbs and flows to life. During the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt, you see this development of liberalism that carries through the 40s, 50s, 60s. And I'm not talking about necessarily like cultural liberalism, but more so economic liberalism, bigger government, greater social spending. In the 60s with Great Society, that's the peak of it. But then by the late 60s, there's this change. Americans, who Nixon would call the silent majority, are starting to question how much money the government's spending. All these rights developments, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, Latino rights, American Indian rights, etc. There's the Vietnam War. There's a lot of change happening, and Americans are starting to push back on it. Richard Nixon is elected in 1968. He is seen as, the more of the establishment candidate. He's not extremely conservative as some people were, becoming at this time, but he is representing a conservative shift. His foreign policy, he wants to end Vietnam peace with honor. By 1973, the Vietnam War is over, but not before it gets expanded into Cambodia and Laos to try to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Nixon's the first president to visit the Soviet Union. He visits China, but what his presidency is most remembered for is Watergate. And Watergate, he doesn't get impeached. He resigns before he would be impeached. But what Watergate exhibits to America is that the federal government is an entity that cannot be trusted the way that it once was. There's been a lot of changes. The JFK assassination, the Martin Luther King assassination, Bobby Kennedy's assassination, the Vietnam War, and the lies that came out about the war with the Pentagon Papers. And you got Watergate. There's this feeling that America is drifting, and that America is not what it once was. The economy in the 70s starts to go sour. From 1945, through the late 60s, the economy is booming. You have, some down years, yes, but overall the economy is booming, booming, booming. But by the mid 1970s, you have stagflation, you have high inflation, you have high unemployment. And Gerald Ford becomes the president after Nixon. Gerald Ford is considered to be a very nice man, a moderating influence. But when he pardons Richard Nixon in 1974, this is something that a majority of the American public does not stand for. Historians have since pretty much declared that he probably did the right thing at the time, considering America needed to heal and move on. But what this probably did in the short term is it probably cost Gerald Ford the presidency. In 1976, the American public elects Jimmy Carter to be president. Jimmy Carter uses human rights as the centerpiece of his presidency. He's a nice man. There's going to be this determination to try to, defeat high oil prices by living with less. That Malaise speech that we talked about. He's going to achieve peace between Israel and Egypt with the Camp David Accords. But what really highlights the Jimmy Carter years is the Iranian hostage crisis, where 52 Americans were taken captive for 444 days in Iran. And what this represented to many people was this declining American influence, declining American power. The economy is not what it once was. Americans' foreign policy isn't what it once was. Is this the new normal? The American public was saying that they feel less confident in the future than they have in the past. And that's something that we as Americans typically do not accept. There is, in the 1970s, which is considered to be more of a liberal decade, there is a rightward shift. There is a pushback. In 1973, you have Roe versus Wade, which legalizes abortion for women through the first trimester. And for many in the growing conservative movement, this was the last straw, that society was becoming too liberal. You had, in the 1960s, you had, the advent of birth control. You had, prayer taking out of public schools. You had Miranda warnings that were instituted. You had the federal government, in the South, they would say Brown versus Board of Education was a huge grab of federal government power. And there's this shift away from that in the 60s and into the 70s. So you have women like Phyllis Schlafly, who vigorously opposed the Equal Rights Amendment, saying that women in this country are the most fortunate group of people in the world. Why would we challenge that? But the conservative movement itself in earnest began in 1964 with Barry Goldwater's presidential run. He failed miserably in his attempt to run, but the South became solidly Republican. 1968, George Wallace is going to run. The South goes solidly for George Wallace, but his policies reflect what the Republican Party is going to adopt in the 70s and 1980s. By 1980, Ronald Reagan wins 44 out of 50 states. There is a culturally conservative shift. There's a politically conservative shift. There's an economically conservative shift. And what this is a reaction to the liberal policies of the 50s, 60s, and 1970s. So America is going to go through a tremendous amount between 1945 and 1980, as it exhibited. When you're studying tonight, I have this up here. This is just an overview of the time, but you can see there's a lot of information here. You have the early Cold War, then you have, if you go up to, the early Cold War, the Red Scare, which was 1950s domestic politics. You have the 83, the boom time, which we talked about with the 50s economy expanding and booming, but then there's cultural changes happening too. So you got the cultural shifts here in the 50s. The civil rights movement from the 50s all the way through 79 here for the book. So that goes through 8-5 and 8-8. Then you have the Cold War expanding. You have Vietnam. You have the Great Society and the Vietnam War and the liberal shift in politics. And then 8-10 is basically the 1970s, Nixon, Ford, Carter. 8-11 is that, liberalism is holding on, but conservatism is making the charge. So good luck with your studying. If you have questions, obviously, please feel free to email me. Have a good day.